Hello, my name is Sister Anna.
And I'm Sister Sarah.
We are both novices in a Carmelite monastery in London. That means we hope we have found our vocation as nuns, and so have taken a concrete step in our discernment journey by trying the life in a religious community. We hope that by sharing with you our story of discovery of a religious vocation, it can help you find your own calling in life. But first of all, what do we mean by vocation, and what is discernment, and why is it so important? One thing to keep in mind is that everyone who is baptized is already called by God to grow in love and in holiness of life. And to discern a vocation is to try and discover the person God wants us to be, and to go deeper into that first dimension of being called. But don't forget that we are all living out our vocation already right now. The Catechism puts it this way.
Incorporated into Christ by baptism, Christians can strive to be imitators of God as beloved children, and walk in love by conforming their thoughts, words, and actions to the mind which is yours in Christ Jesus, and by following his example.
This is what discerning one's vocation is fundamentally about, aiming to follow God's will for our lives along a path that follows the example set by Christ in a way that is unique to each one of us.
Before I entered Carmel, I once attended a talk by a sister who shared her vocation story with us. She likened the discovery of one's vocation according to God's will to a clear blue sky, the most fulfilling pathway, and that anything less than that was like a cloudy sky, still lovely, still good, but not as perfect as the clear blue sky of God's will.
Here's one awe-inspiring truth about vocation. Vocations can be generally grouped into categories, as we'll see in a moment, and they can even resemble each other. On the individual level, each vocation in itself is absolutely unique. The catch, of course, is that it isn't always easy to figure out what our vocation is, and having doubts can be a real trial. Discernment is a lifelong process involved in the decisions we make along the way, or it should be. It's easy to feel overwhelmed or confused by the great number of choices and possibilities presented to us at any given time. Perhaps more acutely at certain stages of life, such as nearing the end of school and having to choose between university or work, to what subject to specialize in, or the type of profession to enter. The need to make decisions can come later on, say after a life-changing event, such as losing a job, or simply a growing restlessness or unhappiness in our current way of life that tells us that something needs to change. Yes, but what? And so, taking time to discern properly can make all the difference in the world. In our own experience, taking the time to consider options was a great help to make a decision that was more informed. However, it is never foolproof, and things can always change. But even when we feel that we have got it wrong or hitting setbacks, this is still part of our journey. God uses everything for our good in the end. When trying to discern a vocation, some challenges along the way can be expected. We can sometimes experience opposition, even from those who are closest to us. It is important then to discern further, preferably with the help of a trusted spiritual guide, whether the opposition is more like a trial and we need to persevere, or if these oppositions are telling us something else. For example, when discerning a possible call to religious life, for instance, it can trigger fears and opposition in those close to us, which can be a real test of vocation and perseverance. In some cases, strong opposition or delays that show no sign of abating can be a sign that we may not be following the best path for us at that particular time. Obstacles within ourselves, fear of commitment, which can be a big stumbling block. This might not be recognizable until a choice has to be made and keeps being avoided. On par with not being able to commit is the issue of expecting too much confirmation or sense of certainty. No matter what we decide in life, we can never be 100% sure. The desire to do God's will is a very important fuel for motivation, especially as one begins to spend time specifically to try and discern where God is calling them. It can also be helpful to keep in mind that the adventure of seeking to do God's will in our lives may well require us to take a leap of faith, perhaps even several of those. At some point, we need to try, or else we run the very real risk of never finding out for ourselves. Ultimately, all vocation stories are love stories, and taking risks or making some sacrifices along the way will be often part of the journey for love. Vocations in the church are usually split into 3 main categories. Let's have a brief look at each of them. Put simply, the vocation to marriage is a call to a life of holiness and service within a couple's own relationship and in their family. The Catechism describes it thoroughly, emphasizing that
by reason of their state in life and of their order, Christian spouses have their own special gifts in the people of God. This grace proper to the sacrament of matrimony is intended to perfect the couple's love and to strengthen their indissoluble unity. By this grace, they help one another to attain holiness in their married life and in welcoming and educating their children.
Here we'll give you quite an extraordinary example, and one that also happens to illustrate an example of vocations within vocations. Here we have a missionary married couple. Katie Davis Majors and Benji Majors got married in 2015 and are American missionaries in Uganda where they met. Katie had already adopted 13 children before she got married.
It is sometimes called apostolic celibacy for lay people. It is a vocation provided it is chosen. Otherwise, it remains more like a default mode for most of us before choosing a specific path. Whether for a time or a lifelong vocation, it can be very fruitful for the church. One can be freer to be involved in parish life or to dedicate themselves to a cause. There is not a formal confirmation process as for other vocations, but this is a real vocation and is of increasing significance in the life of the church. Here are 2 examples of people who led a life of apostolic celibacy, which allowed them to dedicate themselves fully to the work they felt called to do. Dorothy Day and John Bradburn.
A vocation to the religious life is a call to live a life directly consecrated to God. It includes the priesthood for men and many different religious orders for men and women who want to follow Jesus Christ as closely as possible, and to help them to do so, they make vows, such as vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience. Generally speaking, There are two main branches. Apostolic. These are sisters, brothers, or friars who are not enclosed in a monastery. They work outside actively and carry out works of evangelization, teaching, and healthcare, to name but a few. As an example, we can think of the missionaries of charity, Sisters of Mercy, or Franciscans of the Renewal. Monks and nuns who live in an enclosed convent or monastery. They are also called contemplatives, such as Carmelites, Benedictines, Cistercians, or Paul Clares. And within these two main branches, there are many varied congregations and communities, each with its specific charism and way of living out the gospel message. Prayer is an essential element to the discernment process. Getting more involved in church activities, receiving support and guidance from a spiritual director or someone qualified that you trust, looking at various events. Many religious orders now offer discernment days or weekends, come and see events where you can stay with the community for a few days to try out their lives. All the while remaining faithful to the life you are already living. Vocation is not something out there to be found. You are already on the journey. And to put all that we have just discussed into perspective, we will go into our stories, which are about discovering and discerning a vocation to religious life. We hope to shed some light on common questions such as: how do you know that you are called to religious life? How do you figure out which order or community you might be called to? What are the kinds of difficulties you can expect? My first inkling of wanting to be a religious was when I was 13, looking particularly at active orders. I really wanted to be a missionary, but this slowly faded into the background with exams and life generally getting in the way. I am the eldest of 5 children. As a child, I moved around a lot because of my father's job. I was born in Manchester and remain a die-hard Manchester United fan to this day. But we quickly moved to Blackburn in Lancashire, where we stayed for 7 years before moving to Dublin in Ireland, where my parents are originally from. We stayed there for 18 months and moved back to England, to Northamptonshire, where my family eventually settled. My cousin, who happened to be a priest not long ordained, introduced me to Turvey Abbey, a Benedictine community in Bedfordshire, when I was 19. Their charism is centred on the liturgy. They also run retreats, guided and personal, as well as for groups. At that time, I was preparing for my A-levels and not really thinking about the possibility of religious life. I spoke to the superior, who mentioned that they ran monastic weeks for people to see what the life is about, and that it wasn't just for those looking to enter. So I decided to go for a week, and at the end of my stay, I felt that it was something I wanted to do. It felt right, almost like a sense of being home. I spoke to the superior again, and she suggested waiting until I was 21, which I did. In the meantime, I got a job as a security guard with a company, but my heart was set on entering the monastery, and I literally counted down the days until I could do so. There was no discernment process in place as such at the time, in the early 90s, and it was more informal than it would be today. The previous superior at Turvey Abbey had said that she saw a promising spark in me when she saw me play football with my brothers in the monastery garden during a visit. Prior to that, she had worried that I was perhaps a little too quiet. I entered the day after I turned 21 and remained there for 7 years, going through most of the novitiate years, but leaving before final profession, which would have meant staying for life. I think some of the reasons that led me to decide to leave were that I wasn't yet mature enough and felt that I had entered a bit too young, but I never regretted my time there. While I was still in the community, I did an access course in health with a view to going to university to study occupational therapy. I went to Brunel University in London. By then, I was around 28. At the end of it, I started working as an occupational therapist in a hospital in Watford. After 2 years, I got another OT job closer to home in Northampton. After a year, I got a job in a brain injury residential home, which involved caring for disabled people with complex needs, before getting a job at St Andrew's Psychiatric Hospital as a care assistant. Throughout these years, I tried my best to focus on work and not think about a religious vocation. It came to mind at times, now and again, but I'd just push it away. But still, a little niggle developed in my mind which just wouldn't go away, so I went to speak with my parish priest about it, and talking with him helped me over time to see more clearly what I needed to do. He encouraged me to set aside more time for prayer in a particular place in my flat dedicated to that specifically. He also recommended that I become more involved in parish life, so I joined the SVP, the Society of St Vincent de Paul, which is a Catholic organisation dedicated to helping the vulnerable of all backgrounds. I also joined the cathedral's choir and became an extraordinary minister of the Eucharist. I also joined a prayer group held in the convent of the Daughters of the Holy Spirit in Northampton, going with a friend. I found it very helpful, and it further sparked the idea of a vocation to the religious life. By then, I was in my early 40s, and most of the formal discernment programs out there that I came across seemed geared to younger adults, so I felt a bit on my own. And even trying to find a spiritual director to help me in my discernment was difficult, because there were none in Northampton at the time I was looking. One thing I was becoming more aware of was that I was coasting through life without any real focus, and that change was necessary. I realised that the work I was doing in the parish was not enough. I wanted something which would demand more of me. I wanted Christ to be at the centre of my life, not just as an add-on. One evening, as I lay in bed, unable to sleep with all these doubts and questions in my mind, I stumbled across a website called Vision Vocation Network as I was surfing the net on my phone. It had a questionnaire to find out what type of religious vocation you might be called to, and without thinking that anything would come of it, I started answering the questions, and there were a lot of them, very detailed too. I clicked submit and thought nothing more of it. After a few days, however, I started getting emails from various religious communities. At first, I was taken aback. I hadn't realised that the questionnaire had been sent out to those communities that matched the answers I gave. I went through the replies I received, but the only one that stood out came from a woman who advised me to look at the website for the Carmelite Association of Great Britain to see what their charism was and check out their different communities. The ones I looked into are Discalced Carmelites, and their focus is on prayer and living a hidden life in enclosure, meaning that the sisters don't leave the monastery unless absolutely necessary. As I don't drive, I chose the easiest community to get to by public transport, which happened to be the Carmelite monastery in London. The next thing was arranging a visit, and that made me feel very nervous, because I didn't know what to expect. I'd always had a very high regard for this religious order, which to me was like the commandos of the religious life, so I felt in awe of them. When I arrived for my first visit, I met the extern sister first. That's the sister who lives just outside the enclosure, who made me feel at ease straight away. She had a dog called Paddy, who was very friendly, and in fact jumped up at me very enthusiastically as soon as I got there. And as I love dogs, I had a very positive first impression. Then it was time to meet the community superior for the first time in the parlour, a room with a grill. It was quite a startling sight, as I hadn't expected it, especially because as I entered the room, the grill and the wooden shutters were all closed, until the superior arrived from the other side and opened them. I felt encouraged by that first visit, and arranged another meeting, and from that point on, the attraction to Carmel developed more and more. After around a year of visits, I started to feel as if this was the place I was meant to be. So I asked what the next step would be. It was a live-in experience for 1 week to start with, and if I still felt drawn to enter, I would then do a month live-in. I completed both, and each time it felt like a confirmation of what I was feeling. After I got home from my month live-in, my sisters even commented on how happy I looked, and I was. In fact, I had found it very hard to leave the monastery at the end of my live-in. The superior advised me to take time to reflect on the experience and to contact the community again if this was still what I felt called to do. For a while after that, it was back to work as usual. Having to go back to my regular life helped me confirm that I wanted to enter Carmel. My heart wasn't fully in my work anymore. So I contacted the Carmel again and began the next stage of wanting to enter as a postulant, which meant leaving home to join the monastery and live their life, but in my own secular clothes. That's when the formal paperwork started, which included presenting my birth and baptism certificates, as well as completing psychological assessments, which I found daunting. At the time, all these things felt like possible hurdles to entering. But it all went well, and I entered in 2016.
It wasn't before I was in my early 30s that I started discerning a vocation. Originally from France, I had lived in the UK for many years, and the only time I'd ever thought of the possibility of becoming a nun was when I was 12, during a school trip to Lisieux to visit St. Teresa's home in Carmel. I was so inspired by her story that I actually said to one of my classmates that I could see myself wanting to become a nun. But then I got back home and the idea faded away completely. I didn't grow up in a family that practiced its faith. We were Catholic, but rarely went to Mass. I didn't know what it was like to belong to a church or particular community, and I was used to a very secular environment. As a young adult, I drifted away and would probably have been one of those who call themselves spiritual but not religious. I was always wondering about God, though. I really spent a lot of time thinking, talking, and even writing about Him. I wanted God in my life, but was very wary of any kind of formal approach. I struggled a lot to make big decisions regarding my life direction. I was attracted to many different things, had high ideals, and there seemed to be so many options I could go for. And yet nothing stood out powerfully enough to give my all and stick with it. Unsure what to do with my life, I first went to study law at university after high school. By the time I graduated, I knew at least one thing: I didn't want to continue in law. Instead, I decided to go into journalism because I loved writing and it seemed like the ideal profession for me. So I went back to university, and once I graduated, I started working as a reporter for a specialized publication on finance and investments. My idealistic expectation of seeing myself running around as a fearless reporter with a camera dangling around my neck, interviewing people and breaking news stories, kind of came down a good notch as I found myself working from a desk, spending more time interviewing people over the phone and by email than in person. Still, I was learning a lot and began to be sent to cover conferences abroad. At first, I enjoyed flying off to other countries for a day or two to cover a conference and get stories out of them. And yet, despite these positive developments in my career, I felt restless and dissatisfied. Many of my friends were starting to settle down, getting married and having their first children, while I was still single, and I was beginning to worry I wasn't doing things right with my life. I took the drastic decision to quit my job and went traveling as far as I could think of, and ended up spending a few weeks in Peru. Again, I was hoping to find some answers, seeking meaning in my life that just wouldn't come, although the trip in itself was deeply inspiring. I was in my late 20s by then, and when I got back to London, I took the first reporting job I could get. I had to work very hard to produce stories and felt increasingly unhappy in the process. I started going on long hikes during my free time, at first to alleviate the stress from the job, to get away from it all. And I also got into the habit of planning little trips or weekends away to visit places in the country and abroad, which brought me a sense of excitement and helped diffuse the restlessness a bit. And always at the back of my mind, I was hoping that in the midst of all these trips, I would somehow find fulfillment, a sense of being where I was supposed to be, doing what I was meant to do, which so far wasn't there for me. By the time I turned 30, I felt so burnt out from the job because of the intense competition and pressure that I had to take some time out and even felt the need to reconsider what I was doing with my life. This was a very hard decision because I had no idea where it was going to lead me, and I also had to accept that I probably wouldn't get back into journalism after such a long break, and that it may not have been the right vocation for me after all. I started going on various evening courses, mainly creative writing and computing. After a while, I decided to start a conversion course in IT because I enjoyed it. In the meantime, I'd also started to attend Mass regularly, becoming more involved and committed to my faith. One day, I picked up my parish newsletter, and in it, there was an advert for an upcoming discernment group about to start in London called the Samuel Group. The advert asked the reader whether they were looking to find out what God's will was for them, and I thought, yes, maybe that's what I need. Maybe this will help me find out, since I haven't done very well by myself so far. So I joined the discernment group, which ran once a month for a year, looking at all the possible vocations in the church, not just religious life. In fact, when I joined, I was hoping to learn more about married life as the church teaches. Very quickly, people around me started asking if I had thought about becoming a sister. I didn't know what to make of it at first, but I began to attend more retreats, I joined a prayer group and went to a few come and see weekends with active religious communities to get an idea about what religious life was about. I also spent a lot of time browsing the internet, looking at different orders, advice on vocations and stories. The sister who was running the discernment group had also advised to start seeing a priest for spiritual guidance, which I started doing around once a month. Following a silent retreat around the end of 2014, I felt that perhaps God really was calling me to religious life. And at first, I thought that maybe I could be an active sister, as this seemed like a less extreme option. I had this naive idea that it would somehow make it easier for my family to accept, because I would still be out there, than a more radical option like becoming an enclosed nun. But during that retreat, I read St. Teresa's book, Story of a Soul, which happened to be in my room. And after that, I couldn't put Carmel out of my mind. I kept dismissing it as a figment of my imagination, and I was very scared of the radical change it would require if this was where God was calling me. In fact, there were all sorts of practical issues that kept coming to mind to convince me that it was an impossible option. I was an only child, and I knew it would be extremely hard for my mother, and I had a cat called Stewie. Because it was still on my mind and just wouldn't go, I decided to contact the nearest Carmel, which was in London. I was very drawn to their website, the way it was presented. As it happened, they were about to have a special mass one evening to commemorate the founder of the Discalced Carmelite order, Saint Teresa of Avila. It gave me the courage to visit the place first to see what it was like. That evening, the big entrance doors were open and crowds of people had shown up, so I found it easier to go in, mingling with the crowds. I liked the chapel straight away. There was something about it that made me feel at peace and at home. When I saw some of the sisters in their brown habits and their white mantles, I thought they looked like angels. I was totally charmed by it all and decided to get in touch. The first step was to arrange a visit to talk with the superior, and as I walked in, I was struck by the sight of the shutters and grille, which were only opened when the sister arrived on the other side. Suddenly, it was all becoming very real. I was really considering a possible call to Carmel, to an enclosed life in a monastery as a nun. And that was as frightening a thought as it felt exciting and attractive deep in my heart. Frightening, I think, because of what it would mean in concrete terms. The fact that it was such a radical choice that would require leaving everything, literally. I had a very good feeling after that first visit, and we agreed that I should come back once a month while discerning if I had a vocation to Carmel. I found a lot of help in books I happened to read, things I came across on the internet in my search. Somehow they seemed exactly the ones I needed. For example, the sisters lent me a couple of books called Elizabeth Thompson and In the Silence of Mary that told the story of the monastery's foundation in London and of the founding sisters. Reading these books helped me a lot in my discernment because they gave me a deeper understanding of the Carmelite charism and a growing attraction to its spirituality. I also think that the founding sisters' strong commitment and high religious ideals inspired me deeply. It struck a chord with the deep-rooted desire I'd always had, but was only beginning to recognize, to give my whole self to God, and that nothing else in the world could possibly fulfill me. After a few months, I felt so drawn to the life that I asked what the next step was, which was a live-in for a week, and which further confirmed my longing to enter. In the meantime, I went on a lot of little pilgrimages around Europe, such as Lourdes, Fatima, Walsingham. I then went back for a month live-in. I felt that this was where God was calling me, mainly because all the other options in the world no longer attracted me. and for the first time I was starting to feel that I was where I was meant to be. But then I had to go back home again and went through phases of doubt, mainly wondering whether I had imagined how I had felt. I still met the request to enter, but the biggest difficulty was having to tell my mother. I had tried to mention in the past that I was thinking about religious life, but I could tell that she wouldn't accept it easily. So when I decided to enter and was accepted, it was a very painful moment for both of us. Thankfully, she agreed to look after my cat, and over time she found peace with my decision and was very glad to be there for my first profession, which was when I took my temporary vows.